This program is presented by University of California Television. Like what you learn? Visit our website or follow us on Facebook and Twitter to keep up with the latest UCTV programs.
Thank you, Susanna, and want to extend my welcome also to all of you, especially those who traveled from afar for this conference, and those who brought rain with you, very much appreciated. We need it so badly here. In about a month or so, we will have commencement exercises here at UC Santa Barbara, and I will have my farewell speech to the newly minted bachelors. And in that speech, I have the following sentences. And I quote, "You will have great opportunities, but also great responsibilities. I urge you to stand up proudly for science and its value in the fabric of human culture. Use it as an instrument of truth, while recognizing that there are human issues in which science is not the only or even the best arbiter." And then I will wonder, looking at the sea of graduates. I know that the students have all passed many tests, have gotten many A's, and are all well prepared, have their brain full of information and all of that. But have they mastered the art of communication? Have we taught them as scientists to communicate in a world where they will be either in a professional environment or maybe also going on to an advanced degree? Will they indeed be effective communicators, especially in complex areas such as this one, the one topic of today, of sustainability, which is complex, interdisciplinary, draws from many different areas? Will they be able to communicate their science to those who don't speak necessarily their particular language? And this is particularly important in areas like sustainability that have such deep and far-reaching impact on society, on human well-being, and ultimately on our planet. In this room, we all believe that good decisions need to be informed by sound science. Physical and life scientists and engineers have increasingly learned the importance of the work that's done in other areas, in the social sciences, in the humanities, in the arts. And they have a lot to learn. We can learn a lot from those disciplines in how we need to frame our messages so that people understand the work that we are doing. So without further ado, I just want to, again, thank Susanna and Ron for putting this together. This conference couldn't be more timely. It is at the very heart of one of the most important initiatives across campus, sustainability. And I also want to acknowledge Duncan Mellenchamp, if you don't mind standing up. Duncan is our strong supporter in this. He and his wife Suzanne have done so much for this campus, and in particular, as far as the cluster of chairs that Susanna has mentioned. We are in the midst of recruiting some phenomenal talent, and I'm very optimistic that this will really pull together our efforts in sustainability across campus even more, and I'm very, very optimistic. So without further ado, I wish you all a very productive day. I will have to run off, but I'm looking forward to seeing what comes out of this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pierre. And I want to just add that we have been so fortunate to have the strong support of many deans on this campus. Pierre is a great supporter, but he is one of several, and I'm delighted that this cross-disciplinary initiative, this cross-campus initiative, has received so much attention and so much support. We are now ready to start the exciting part of the program. We are going to hear from some wonderful speakers today. This first session is about communicating science content, and we have two wonderful speakers for you. The first one will be Jennifer Ouellette. She is a resident of Los Angeles, an author, an editor, a blogger. She is, I think, far more adept in social media than 99% of scientists that I know, including myself. But she has excelled also in communicating science in conventional ways. She's the author of several popular science books, which are beautifully written, and was extremely articulate last night at the movie, talking about the challenges that scientists face in communicating their ideas and in framing their ideas. So we certainly are very interested to hear about that. She's written for many newspapers. Those are prestigious journals like the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the LA Times, the New York Times Book Review, and on and on. She's obviously very experienced in this area. She's also a blogger, and if you want to know how to talk to people about physics at cocktail parties, I gather she is the one person in the audience today who is the world expert in this area. Jennifer, we are delighted to have you with us today. I know that you're no stranger to Santa Barbara. She was actually writer-in-residence at the Kavli Institute a few years ago, and I'm glad to have this opportunity to introduce you to a broader spectrum of the UCSB campus. Welcome.
Which one of these is changing my slide? This one? Okay, great. Okay, I have the unenviable task of giving you a whirlwind tour of content. And as you've seen already from the opening remarks and from the video that was playing in the beginning, that's a big thing. Let's see, go to next. There we go. So the problem that we have in science communication is a very simple one. There's an enormous knowledge gap between what scientists wish the average person knew and what they actually know. And the goal of science communication, I think most of us agree, is to close that gap for various reasons. It just is not helpful to have that kind of gap between what's, how scientists think and how the community thinks. And as we saw last night, having people who are ignorant of science and how the scientific process works can actually have, very important long-term deleterious effects, I think is the best way to put it. So traditionally, we thought of science communication as this sort of traditional science news cycle. You have a researcher, they're in their lab, they're doing their paper, and they discover that A is correlated to B with this p-value of 0.56, and that goes through to the press officer who has to find a way to turn that result into something that newspaper reporters want to cover. So they say very carefully, possible link between A and B. That trickles down to the newswire organizations, which somehow it gets simplified to A causes B, because they don't understand that correlation and causation are different. That trickles out to the internet, and then the cable news picks it up because they saw it on a blog somewhere, someone appalled that, A somehow, causes this really bad thing B, and we should actually, sign petitions to get A taken off the market. And then down to local news, and finally it ends up with your grandmother wearing a tinfoil hat to ward off A. And parts of that still hold true, but I would argue that that's simply not really a good broad-based model for science communication, because it's so much bigger than that. That's kind of your traditional top-down approach. Now we don't have just this very simple linear trickle-down effect of science news. And science communication is not the same as news dissemination. So we've tended to think of science communication as we want to get our work out there so that people are aware of it. Well, that's dissemination of information, and it's important. Communication is a two-way street, and the good news is there are more outlets for that two-way street than ever. What we now have is this vast ecosystem. Where all these little things interact and link together in lots of interesting ways. It's a complex network, if you will. So now you'll have something come out in a press release, and maybe it'll make it into the print media, but first you're going to see it on a blog or a news site somewhere, if you're lucky, with a link back to the original paper. And someone will post the link to that on Twitter. It'll eventually trickle down into an actual news story, say in the New York Times, or a magazine article. Perhaps someone later on will make a fun little YouTube video or something, and that will pop off that. People will be talking about it on op-eds, on blog posts, on podcasts, and then maybe at some point you'll be asked to appear on Science Friday because Ira Flatow heard about it and he realizes this is something people are talking about this week and he wants to cover it. And so it becomes this sort of cauldron of things that bubble around and interact with each other. And it's not just this very simple linear top-down thing. So understanding that, I think, is the first point that I want to make. The bad news is misinformation still proliferates. The good news is we can get our message out. The bad news is bad information gets spread just as easily as our good information, and people are not necessarily able to tell the difference. I mean, I used a physics example because that's my specialty. The God particle, we can't kill that thing. The Higgs boson got nicknamed the God particle early on. It has nothing to do with God. Everyone from Rush Limbaugh to Republicans in Congress misinterpret this to mean that particle physics is trying to basically disprove God, and it has nothing whatsoever to do with any of that. It's a very, very unfortunate misnomer that we are unfortunately stuck with because it spread so quickly and so fast that it's now a meme. So why? You know, we talked about this a little bit last night, why misinformation proliferates and what we can do to combat it. And I think one thing that became very clear from the movie last night and the discussion after is that the traditional approach of what I think some social psychologists call the information deficit model is not that effective. It assumes that people have a lack of understanding and don't accept scientific findings because they don't fully understand them. And so clearly, what we must do is educate them. And it's a noble effort, and there are a few people who, if you educate them, you know, will change their minds. In The Merchants of Doubt, it featured Michael Shermer, who spent a period as a climate change denier, and then he finally went and really looked at the latest research, and he said, well, you know, you can't argue with science, I was wrong, and he changed his mind. That is so rare, and God bless Michael Shermer for doing that. For the rest of us, not so much. You know, people seem to just really resist the facts. You know, for some reason, particularly on something like climate change, or the anti-vaccination movement. These are things that get tied into people's self-identity, how they identify with certain tribes. I think in the movie last night, we kept hearing climate deniers talk about, well, you're on the other team, as if it's a sporting event. And so if you come at them with facts, even if those facts are true, they feel like you are attacking not just their ideas, but who they personally are, and they are going to dig down, double down, and push back harder. The physics community had a version of this when the Large Hadron Collider was coming online back in a few years ago now, 2007, something like that, 2006. And there was a retired high school teacher who had worked briefly as a nuclear engineer who decided that the Large Hadron Collider was going to create a black hole that would destroy the universe and tried to bring a lawsuit. And it was ridiculous, but he got equal time, you know, on the news. And the news covered this as well. Maybe we should listen to this guy. Maybe the scientists haven't thought about this. Trust me, they thought about it. They had reports this thick that looked at those possibilities. And I myself wrote blog posts debunking this. Many prominent people, it appeared in, you know, debunking posts appeared in the New York Times, in science magazines. They showed up on the news stories. Nothing took. Until John Oliver did a segment on The Daily Show, a comedy show, where he essentially went to CERN, interviewed the guys at CERN, and interviewed Walter, the guy who was bringing the lawsuit, and he killed him in this one moment where, you know, we had the physicists saying there's no chance this is going to happen, and Walter saying it's a 50-50 chance, and so Oliver said, Walter, you keep going on about 50-50. What do you mean by that? He goes, well, something can happen or it can't, so 50-50. And there was this beat, and Oliver went, I'm not sure that's how probability works, Walter. And for some reason, that moment crystallized it in the public's mind, and now people still joke about the LHC destroying the world, but nobody takes it seriously, and we haven't heard from Walter Wagner since. So what can we learn from that? Here's one approach that works. You can recite facts all you want, but that one little moment of insight was all it took. It had, you know, if all Oliver had done was recite a bunch of facts, he would not have been as effective as he was in that one moment. So why did it work? And part of the reason is it's not a lecture. Science communication is about making this fundamental connection. When I say it's a two-way street, I mean that. This is kind of like the Vulcan mind world, where you have to connect with how they think and get on their wavelength, so to speak. And as I said, the good news is we have more tools and outlets than ever before for doing that. Unfortunately, the public resonates at a very different frequency from scientists. They use different language. They have a different cultural background. And so you have to actually understand a little bit about, how do you make those connections? How do you bridge those gaps? And a lot of what I do as a science writer has been based on that from the very beginning. My background was as an English major, so I actually do understand the horror that many English majors feel when approaching math and physics or something scary sounding like that. We have been trained through our cultural education to push back and resist, all those things. It reminds us of that boring physics class that we took in high school, and we don't understand that we are actually, denying ourselves a very rich part of human culture by not following up and not following science and being afraid of science. So I looked for ways to engage them. And one way I found to engage them was to find common ground and to tie the science to what they already cared about. This, is not particularly groundbreaking today because now everybody does it on blogs. Every time a movie comes out, there's a million blog posts about the science behind X, Y, or Z. And that's wonderful because, Lawrence Krauss was doing it back in like 1980s with the physics of Star Trek. I had a book on the physics of the Buffyverse because I was a big Buffy the Vampire Slayer fan. The reason that worked was because I was genuinely a fan of the show. And then I looked at the rules. Physics is the rules of what makes the world work, and I looked at the rules that had been set up in the fictional universe of the Buffyverse and compared and contrasted with real-world physics. For calculus, I was always afraid of calculus, so I decided at 40 to learn calculus and wrote the calculus diaries about my journey. Again, a way of connecting, getting people who were afraid of math, who had that little, ooh, an equation, I don't want to look at that. It's an involuntary reflex. This was a way to kind of say, look, I'm like you, or I was like you, and if I can learn this, so can you. And bring them along with me on the ride, with humor, with real-world examples, and that sort of thing. Rhett Elaine takes this one step further. He is a physicist who blogs at Wired. He had a blog called .physics, and now I think he's just been folded into the Wired. Several years ago, he became fascinated with that popular app, Angry Birds, which is a little game that you play on your phone. Again, he genuinely loved the game, but he's a physicist. So he really ended up writing a series of blog posts analyzing the physics behind the birds' trajectories, because he noticed that they all had different properties and things, like one would do a parabola. Was their vertical acceleration constant? And he used these to teach his students, and then he blogged about it. And the blog posts actually really get into the nitty-gritty. It's a little bit more of a teaching tool than what I do on Cocktail Party Physics. And I actually had someone say, leave a comment on my blog saying, for a less fluffy approach to this, go read Rhett Elaine. And I went, well, I'm happy to be the fluffy one, because I'm the gateway drug. And then they become less afraid, and then they go read Rhett stuff, and they learn a little bit more, and then maybe they want to take a class. And this is how it works. Now, when you do this, you have to manage your expectations. This is an example of something I wrote for Slate. It ended up being in the food section, which I was very proud of, because usually my stuff, because it's about physics, gets shuttled off into the science section and fewer people read it. You can tie it into something that people care about their food and their cooking. And so this was actually a research paper. Some MIT materials scientists were studying the structural mechanics of thin shells, eggshells being one, but also chocolate eggshells and thin films and things like this. Coatings, essentially, is what they were studying. It's not really a sexy topic. If I pitched, there's this really cool paper showing X equals Z, on plastic model shells. No one cares. But I said, this is actually scientific proof of the best way to crack an egg. And I ended up opening with that famous scene from Sabrina, the Audrey Hepburn movie, where she's taking that French class, learning how to make a souffle, and you do that one-handed crack. And I asked the researcher when I interviewed him, I'm not going to be able to go into really a lot of in-depth science here because I have to get like one or two messages across. What's the one thing you care about? And he says, if you could just get people to understand that there's a difference between strength and rigidity, material scientists would thank you. So I made sure to fit that message in. And it ended up being a very popular, well-emailed thing on the site. But if I tried to be a little too elaborate, it wouldn't have worked. So it doesn't always, sometimes the challenge is really big. I wrote a feature for an online thing called Quanta Magazine that got excerpted at Scientific American, as you can see, on a raging debate going on in theoretical physics right now on black holes. And if you look at it, there's a lot of big ideas, okay, and they're scary sounding. ADS-CFT duality, Hawking radiation, non-locality, black hole entropy, effective field theory, monogamous quantum entanglement. How do you even begin to engage a reader with this sort of thing? Well, it turns out you have one very easy way to an entry point into that, which is what happens when you fall into a black hole. We used to think that when you cross that point of no return, the event horizon, that you wouldn't notice anything special until you got near like the singularity where gravity would get so strong it would rip you to shreds. Some string theorists said, no, wait, it might be that as you actually get burned up in a wall of fire right at the event horizon and you never get a chance to get ripped to shreds. So you die horribly, but you get to choose maybe which one you want. And then to present the arguments, it really boiled down to a logic problem. It boiled down to you have three tenets that physicists love. Not all three can be true at the same time. Pick one to sacrifice. Which do you choose? And it's kind of, Raphael Busseau called it the menu from hell. And it made it, people went, oh, okay, there's a lot of scary sounding words here and big ideas, and ultimately we're talking about the fabric of space-time, and I'm scared of it, but I do understand that this is just logically not possible to have three things that cannot all be true. And I understand the concept of picking something to sacrifice. You can't do anything like that if you're in broadcast media. My husband is a physicist at Caltech, Sean Carroll. This is Lisa Randall, a Harvard physicist. Both appeared on the Colbert Report to hawk their books. Stephen Colbert, when he had his parody show, the Colbert Report, he's now taking over for, I think, Letterman? Yeah. And so he loved having scientists on, he said, because it was satire. He played a right-wing host who was really stupid, and he would play dumb and be really obnoxious. And scientists, he said, were great because they didn't get rattled. They could always fall back on their science, and they would just, they were the perfect straight man. So the way you tailor your message to fit this format is the producer spent a lot of time with Sean on the phone before he appeared on the show saying, let's go over your message one more time. You're going to have, it's a 10-minute segment, 5 of that's going to be you, tops. You better have your message down. Pick 2 things and repeat them over and over again. And those are the things, and that's your 5 minutes, and that's what you can get across. And she worked with him to craft that message. And it was a very, very good exercise for him, because being able to boil it down to those 2 or 3 key ideas, even if you end up writing an entire long book, what sells the book ultimately is going to be those 2, 3 key ideas. So it's actually a worthy goal to spend going over and over and trying to figure out what that core element is. Let's see. I was on the Craig Ferguson show, the Late Late Show with Craig Ferguson. As a shy person, it was the most terrifying thing I've ever done. But his approach is a little bit different. But the lesson I learned from being on Craig Ferguson is that you want to go with the flow. He's much more easygoing. One of the first things he usually does is, you talk to his programmer and she comes up with questions and she gives them to him, and the first thing he does when you come out is rip up the questions. He's an improv guy, he's a comedian, and he basically wants people to kind of have a give and take with him, and he wants to riff on what you're saying, and you kind of just got to go with it. You can plan all you want, but you got to throw the playbook out the window with Ferguson. And he asked a very, very good question on phantom traffic jams and what caused them. And there is a very good answer, and with time I could craft that into a 2 or 3 minute soundbite, but I didn't have it. And it was too complicated to really explain, so I said something that was half right, and then he took off and started talking about phone cars or something, and we just moved on. Again, it's not a lecture. This is not actually about information dissemination. This is about getting science out there, getting it talked about and laughed about in the broader culture. And the other corollary I learned is that likability matters. If you win their hearts, you win their heads. I actually ended up winning the golden harmonica. What he does is he would have guests choose to either have an awkward, uncomfortable silence or attempt to play a harmonica. And if you can produce a recognizable tune, you win the golden harmonica. And I managed to crank out Home Sweet Home because I used to play when I was like 12. It was kind of borderline. Honestly, it was a pity award, and it was because the audience loved that I tried, and they just cheered until he gave me the golden harmonica. But that's something to remember, because again, you can hit them with all the facts you want, but if they like you first, they might be able to follow you, and if they see you as a person and like you and as a person, they will want to hear what you're saying. My husband actually did a debate with William Lane Craig on atheism and cosmology, God and cosmology. And it was on enemy ground, so to speak. It was at a theological seminary in New Orleans. And so honestly, there was the only other people who were on Sean's side were the people that he picked on his panel. And everybody else just, hated the atheists. But here's the thing, he was so likable that I could visibly watch the Christians in the audience kind of going, we actually like him better than William Lane Craig, and we're just really, really upset at what he has to say. But who knows that he might have planted a seed there, that 2 or 3 people in that audience might, then because they liked him, start thinking a little more deeply about these issues. Changing minds is a long-term endeavor. We're going to play a long game in science communication. We can measure short-term effects all we want, but we don't actually know 10 years down the line what's going to change a person's life, something that we said 10 years earlier, and that we might have planted a seed that bore that. It just took a long time for that to bear fruit. Experiment with new and emerging formats. Don't be afraid of trying out Twitter or starting a blog or Pinterest or these various things. It might not be for you, and you don't have to do it forever, but play with the new tools that are out there. Make a YouTube video, appear on a podcast, start your own podcast. I have been doing for the last couple of years this sort of talk show in Second Life with avatars that's also broadcast as a podcast on Blog Talk Radio. That's the astrophysicist Jana Levin. One of the fun things is, first of all, where else do you get an hour to really sit down and talk to a scientist in depth about these ideas? People can come and listen to it later if they're not on Second Life. And I get to choose what kind of avatars scientists pick. Oftentimes they just want it to look like themselves, but Jana wanted to be a unicorn. And Simon DeDeo, who's a complexity scientist, appeared as a swarm of butterflies, which was my personal favorite. And also make it personal. Again, this gets to the likability factor. I think I said last night, we don't often realize that most people never ever meet a working scientist. I don't think I met a working scientist who wasn't a teacher of some sort until I was in my 20s. And I was, reasonably well educated, middle class. It's not like I was living in a ghetto somewhere, okay? I mean, there's just not a lot of give and take between those worlds. So we started this program last year in Los Angeles. We'd invite a scientist. It'd be in a private home. It was a group of friends and their friends, so that everybody felt comfortable. They were not afraid to ask dumb questions. They got to know the scientist. He or she would give some informal comments. You've got John Preskel there, Kevin Hand from JPL. And many of them are actors, actresses, producers, writers. We have some artists, we have some science communicators there. It's a very good mix of people. But the one thing they love is science. In fact, in the corner you have a group called the Sirens. They're actresses who are basically trying to promote science outreach and education and awareness in the entertainment industry. I'm going to try and wrap up quickly because I don't want to take up too much time. But that Hollywood connection is very, very interesting. From 2008 to 2010, I was the founding director of a program called the Science and Entertainment Exchange that the National Academy of Sciences set up. It's basically an exchange program for science consulting, at least in theory. I mean, and that's how it was originally conceived. And my job essentially was to build bridges between these two worlds. We would get calls in from writers, directors, producers saying, we're doing a show and there's a scene where there's some science in it and we need an expert in X. And I would find a good person for that. And it was not necessarily like the Nobel Prize winner. It was possibly, a young grad student or a postdoc or a young research faculty who was a little bit more adept at science communication, who understood the needs of narrative, because that is something that is different when you're consulting. It's not about getting the science 100% correct. The science is always in service to the story. So a good consultant understands that. But we're kind of in a golden age of science and entertainment. Hollywood, there's actually a growing contingency of people in Hollywood who really do love science. A lot of the stories that they want to tell now have scientific components to them, and they're forging these relationships. Ultimately, I think the important part of what comes out of the Science and Entertainment Exchange is going to be the lasting relationships. And we've already seen examples of that. The movie Interstellar came out just last year. This is Kip Thorne working with Jessica Chastain. This movie happened because Kip Thorne was a science consultant, knew Carl Sagan on Contact years ago, dated Linda Obst briefly, and they remained friends, and she introduced him to Steven Spielberg, and Spielberg wanted to write a scientifically accurate as possible movie that could still be entertaining. And for 10 years, they worked on it. And in the end, Spielberg had a falling out with Paramount, and Christopher Nolan ended up directing it, and let's say that Nolan cared a little bit less about the science. the grain of Kip's ideas still got in there, and among other things, it developed a scientific tool. He ended up developing these wonderful computer simulations for how to depict a three-dimensional black hole, and as a result, in the movie, you have one of the best cinematic depictions of what a black hole would actually look like, right up there in the top left-hand corner, because of the work Kip did. And the computer modeling work he did ended up being very useful for physicists in turn. So that's a wonderful example of that interplay and how those sort of interactions and relationships can play out. And sometimes it takes a while. When I first joined the Exchange, my husband and I consulted with the staff writers on Bones, which is a crime detective show, and she's a forensics bone expert, and they wanted to do something with the death of a physicist or a murder of a physicist or death by physics. And it turned out that they really didn't know anything about physics. We had to explain to them that no, physicists would not be meeting at Mensa, and that they would be having a regular physics conference devoted to it. And they actually they wanted to hear about publisher parish and some of the cultural aspects. And we really only had a couple hours with them, and we saved them from the worst mistakes. They got a couple of the things were just kind of, they clearly don't understand the culture of science. But in the end, 6 years later, they called back, and they had this other episode they wanted to do featuring a physicist whose gymnastics daughter is murdered, and the FBI detective Booth thinks that he's not reacting with sufficient emotion, therefore he's a suspect. And Brennan, who is the scientist, says, no, he's like me, he expresses it differently. And what they wanted to do, Richard Schiff played the physicist, and at the very end, the final scene, he replaces the research equations on his board with a mathematical poem to his daughter's life, and the equations of movement. It showed her at rest. It showed her learning to walk. It showed her doing tumbling. It showed her on a balance beam or a trampoline. And here she is being carried on his shoulders. There's not a dry eye in the place. In fact, a blogger called TV Mouse basically said, guys, I cried about a math equation this week. That's the power when you really marry science to the story. And the equations were accurate. Sean spent 2 days on set writing the equations and interacting with the actors and the writers and the staff people there. And it really was a gorgeous scene. I don't remember what the title of the episode was, but it's worth watching. And that brings me to my final point. There's this whole new culture that's come up with TV recaps. Like I said, I cried about a math equation this week. This woman has been basically watching Bones and writing summaries of the episode with spoilers. And they do it for Game of Thrones, they do it for Mad Men, they do it for everything. So when WGN America, a small cable show, launched a new series called Manhattan, a fictionalization of the Manhattan Project, wanting to explore science and secrecy and the impact it has both personally and professionally and on the nation, they chose this era in order to do it. They fictionalized it because they didn't want, they didn't want to get, people complaining all the time about the historical inaccuracy. They wanted some freedom, some creative freedom to create these stories. And so at Scientific American, I started recapping it every week and squeezing in some background science. By the way, this little element, here's what's actually going on in that scene, and here's the actual physics, that formed the basis of that. And as a result, I got to know the showrunner, and I did a Q&A with him. And later on, someone was asking him about, how it got renewed for a second season, in part because myself and a guy at Popular Science and someone else started recapping it. And he says, thank God for the TV recaps, because we never would have gotten renewed. In part because nobody gets WGN America on their cable. It's actually hard to find. So you have to watch it on Hulu Plus if you don't get it. And in my case, I actually threw myself at the mercy of the PR department, so I got screeners. So I'm going to end there, but I'm going to end on this repeating once again, all of these things feed into this ecosystem. Everything that we do in every single format is not standalone. It's not just one thing. It's all the things interacting together in this vast ecosystem. And you also have to bear in mind that it's a never-ending process, and we're playing a long game. It's easy to get discouraged. I certainly was feeling discouraged after watching Merchants of Doubt last night. But we persevere. And over time, you do see changes. You do see cultural shifts. It took 50 years, as we learned last night, for the tobacco companies to finally get held accountable, but it will happen. And I think that is the one note of hope on which I'd like to end.
Thank you, Jennifer. That was amazing. We're going to have questions at the end of the session. I'm sure there are some there already for Jennifer. Now I'd like to introduce our next speaker, who's, I'm not sure if he has slides. Our next speaker is Richard Hutton, and Richard is no stranger to UCSB. He has been with us as Executive Director of the Carsey Wolf Center and Adjunct Professor in the Film and Media Studies Department, but is now taking on a new role as Chief Strategist for Octos with the Office of Research at UCSB. He comes from a distinguished career in film production. He has won all kinds of awards, Emmys and Grammys and Peabodys for his documentaries on science in the areas of intelligent design, emotional life, evolution, an incredibly distinguished CV full of accomplishments in the area of communicating science to broad audiences, and we are delighted to have you with us today, Richard.
Thanks, Susanna. Appreciate it. And Jennifer, you were majored in English, is that right? I majored in Russian history. So you really have a pair of complete incompetents telling you how to communicate science. It's great. You know, Jennifer's talk, I think, was right on the button when it came to talking about the ecosystem of media and how that works in sciences and how science tries to reach out to non-scientists in order to cross that chasm that exists between what scientists know and don't know and what the public understands. I'm going to do something slightly different and really additive to what Jennifer did. And I'm going to talk about, in communicating science to the public, how do you decide what to include and what to leave out? How should you think about conveying the science while embedding it in a narrative? The challenge is to take something that lives in one sphere and to connect it successfully with another. If you think about it as kind of a Venn diagram, you have over here sort of the big science sphere with all the facts and the information in it. And over here you have the big audience circle with its predispositions, its biases, misinformation, limited attention span, and so on. And then right in the middle is this tiny little sliver where the two meet, where your content and your audience can converge through the framing, positioning, and dissemination of the information. This morning I'm going to talk about a case study of one of my own projects because it's a kind of easy way to go deep on it and to illustrate the challenge of presenting science accurately and simply, but not simplistically. It shows one way of how we can approach this problem and try to solve it. In 1998, Paula Absel, who's the executive producer of Nova, asked me to create Evolution, an 8-part series, an 8-hour series on the theory that is central to all biology, and essential information, both for scientists, of course, and also for the public at large, because frankly, if you don't understand the nature of evolution, you don't understand the nature of life on Earth. From the get-go, an idea like Evolution presents a challenge to a communicator. First, how do you divide a series like that up? Television is a rigid, unforgiving format. At PBS at the time, 1-hour show used to be 53 minutes and 47 seconds. Not 53 minutes maybe, not 54 minutes maybe, but 53:47. So if you're doing an 8-hour series on a single topic, how do you make sure that each show not only lasts exactly 53:47, but deserves to be exactly that long? You can't take a topic that deserves a half hour and stretch it into the full 53 minutes. And you can't take something that requires hours and just fragment it and put it almost incomprehensibly into a smaller package. So then, how do you take these 8 hours and make each show an appropriate sized module in and of itself, and then string a bunch of these appropriate sized modules together in a way so that each module can both stand on its own and lead logically into the next one? That's the sort of challenge of a multi-part series on television. Finally, how do you take the science in each of those modules and do 3 things? First, how do you simplify it without dumbing it down? Remember, we had a mere 8 hours, and evolution's been going on for 3.7 billion years. So we had basically 141,000 years of evolution for every second of television time. Second, how do you take what can be dry, non-contextual stuff and give it context? Our audience was not scientists. Evolution was a primetime show for a national audience and therefore needed to be interesting to our viewers. And we wanted to make the information, in a sense, sticky, memorable. And to do that is not just a matter of giving the information, as Jennifer pointed out so eloquently, but also doing it within an emotional context or a humorous context. Well, I guess humor is a form of emotion, isn't it? Tragedy, humor, there you go. And third, how do you use storytelling as a way of framing the science and giving it drama without allowing the story to overwhelm the information? To me, this is the holy grail, once you've solved for the first two, because this is where you actually translate the science into something that is both specific and ties into the audience's emotional state. It's where, as a producer, you ask the question, what's the story? Who are the characters? What's their quest? What are their challenges? And how do they confront those challenges, all without losing sight of the science? Okay, so we divided the series up. For evolution, that meant actually 7 shows. The first show was called Darwin's Dangerous Idea, and it was actually a 2-hour special. I guess that makes it like 107 minutes, that explored both the life of Charles Darwin, how he developed his theory, and the current state of that theory. To satisfy the storytelling aspect of the show, we decided to take a big risk and tell Darwin's story through drama. Not through recreations, but a full-on 5-act period costume drama interspersed with documentary segments echoing the same ideas, a kind of Nova meets Masterpiece Theater. The other 6 shows in the series dealt with elements of evolution in rough descending order, shows on deep evolutionary principles, extinction, the evolutionary arms race between competitors, predator and prey, sex, the explosion, the Big Bang of the human mind, and finally the controversy surrounding evolution and religion. Rather than try to take you through the entire decision-making process, I'm going to really talk about one sequence that we did and give you one way of how we tackled or tried to tackle this challenge, and then show you the footage that came out of it. In addition to executive producing the series, I co-produced, directed, and wrote one of the episodes on extinction with a producer named Kate Churchill. Now, there have been 5 major extinctions in the history of life on Earth. And the third show, the extinction show, asked, are we on the cusp of a 6th? And are human beings the trigger? Clearly, the rate of extinction is skyrocketing, and habitat destruction and invasive species are 2 of the major causes. And so we covered them in the show. But we also wanted to explain a bit about how human incursion affected extinction as well. So we researched the issue pretty thoroughly, and then we went looking for a story that could illustrate it, and we came upon Alan Rabinowitz. At the time, Alan worked for the Wildlife Conservation Society in New York City. He had become widely known for his work studying big cats, lions, tigers, and most famously, jaguars in South America. He's an amazing kind of guy, and what he was trying to get to was this notion of keystone species in an ecosystem. If you think of what a keystone is, you think about one of those wonderful arch, and that stone in the middle that makes the arch stable. Well, keystone species in an ecosystem are those species that make the ecosystem stable, and without them, the ecosystem changes dramatically, and in some cases no longer ceases to exist. In any case, after several meetings, he agreed to participate in our film, and he suggested that we all go to Myanmar to look for an endangered species of deer. Well, we'd had our hearts set on big cats, but Alan was our guy, and at that point he was looking for deer, so we were interested in deer. To make a long story short, we spent months trying to get permission from the Myanmar government, and they said yes, and then at the last minute they refused to give us visas, and we were stuck. And then Alan said, well, we also have this project in Kankrajan, which is Thailand's largest national park. We're trying to evaluate the tiger population using camera traps. You want to try that? Yeah, we did. We really did. So Kate went with Alan to Thailand to look for tigers, and we hoped to find a story that would both emotionally involve people and also illuminate the precarious nature of the balance of life in forests around the world. The story looked, just from the outside, as if it might fall into the genre of storytelling called the hero's journey. It's kind of a classic form. The hero moves from the ordinary world, goes on an adventure, faces challenges or crises, solves a problem, receives a reward, and returns home changed. As you can imagine, since we were making a documentary, we had no assurances that this would actually happen. But as documentarians, you turn on your camera and you take a chance. And Alan was a strong character, Kenkajaan was cool, and anything can happen in a national forest. And things could, in fact, go very, very wrong. As an illustration of both how good intentions and luck, good luck for us, maybe not so much for Alan, play important roles, I'd like to show you the first part of that story.
We're in grave danger of the empty forest syndrome. Having a beautiful, seemingly intact forest on the surface, but inside that forest, the natural components which maintain the flow of energy through the system, it's disrupted. Now, people say, so what does it matter if one component's gone? What if you don't have the Sumatran rhino? What if the civet species are all gone, or other things? But each thing has evolved to play an incredibly important role within this complex puzzle.
Alan Rabinowitz wants to know if Kenkajaan has escaped the escalating rates of extinction found elsewhere. So he and his colleague, Tony Lynham, collect data on the actual number of animals living in the park, especially the carnivores.
Large carnivores, such as tigers, are often the first animals to be wiped out from a system. If you go into an area and find relatively abundant sign of large carnivores, you know what you're dealing with by necessity is a very healthy, at least seemingly stable natural habitat.
The typical habitat works this way. Sunshine, nutrients, and water make plants grow. The plants are eaten by herbivores, which in turn are eaten by carnivores. About 100 pounds of plants generally sustain about 10 pounds of herbivore, which sustain about 1 pound of carnivore. Healthy carnivores mean a healthy forest. When Alan Rabinowitz was here last, the news about the forest was good.
More than 10 years ago, I landed here in Kenkajaan National Park. We got down in here, and I was very pleased to see that the place was beautifully intact in terms of the vegetation, but more importantly, I was able to find tiger sign virtually everywhere I looked. I would hike through small rivers, and there'd be families of otters starting to swim around me. Elephants came to my camp at night. Gibbons sang every single morning. Hornbills flew overhead all the time. All the signs of a healthy, intact, relatively unhunted forest were there, which made it probably one of the few places in Thailand. And in fact, when I surveyed throughout the entire country at the end of the survey, it became even more clear that Kenkajaan was easily the most pristine, the most untouched piece of forest left in this entire country.
But is it the same today? On a search for life, every stop offers more clues.
Fresh elephant, nice size. His cat, small cat.
The group uses well-traveled elephant paths to navigate the forest.
An elephant trail is a trail that elephants are walking on constantly, and every time they walk past this vine, they just push it back this way and then push back this way, and all of the bark has started to come off.
3 other teams are in the park, each retrieving special cameras with motion sensors, which were carefully placed a month before. Called camera traps, they take a photo when triggered by an animal walking by.
Batteries, I guess. The camera's taken a whole roll of film and it's rewound, so there's 36 shots taken.
What the camera traps will help us do is start wrapping some numbers around these things, helping us quantify. It's one thing to say, boy, sign of tiger is everywhere. It's another to say, just on this one survey, we have taken pictures of a minimum of X numbers of tigers.
The cameras serve as an unseen observer. In one day, a camera trap can catch more tigers on film than Rabinowitz's team could see in months.
I'd say tonight camp here, tomorrow morning go down the stream and check out this area and check out what we've got in terms of
So that's where you think we might have Siamese crocodile?
Yeah.
That would be neat. That'd be something else.
The Siamese crocodile is a species that 30 years ago lived throughout the tropical forests of Asia. But they have been relentlessly hunted for their skins. Not a single one has been seen in over a decade.
Is this it, Tony? These are some fresh ones, right?
Oh yeah, those are fresh.
Siamese crocodile, a species thought to be either virtually extinct or extinct in this country and incredibly endangered throughout all of its existing range. If we prove the existence of a population of Siamese crocodile in Genkajan, that in itself, apart from everything else, will make this one of the most important areas in the entire country.
Over on the other side of the bank there, we saw tracks of Asiatic black bear, which is the largest bear species in Thailand, and also tracks of a large tiger. So we call this place Carnivore Corner because it's got all of the three carnivores.
With another roll of film and sightings of carnivore tracks, the team presses on to pick up the rest of the cameras. But suddenly, there's a hitch.
Camera's gone.
You're kidding.
The camera's gone.
Who the hell is this? Somebody
stole it.
Damn it, somebody stole it. Yeah, you can see it's been cut. It's been cut right here.
Somebody's come in and cut the bamboo and taken the trap.
It could mean we have a thieving problem, or it could mean that this area is being more hunted than we think it's being hunted.
Gone. It's gone. The camera trap
There's
is
a
gone.
combination. Again, the combination, you know.
And that one? Gone. I can't believe this. This is stupid. Why is this happening? Why would they want to take the cameras?
Ramifications of losing these cameras, there's a lot of ramifications. In terms of data, it's a major loss. It takes an incredible amount of planning and time and effort to even get to do an area like this. This area was chosen for its remoteness. The fact that it's quite obvious that these cameras are being both stolen and vandalized is very bad. I've never seen this in my 20-plus years in the field.
It looks like somebody's come along in front of the camera, taken a picture of themselves. They didn't want that to happen. So they tried to take the camera. They tried to slash the lock, but the locker's got a steel cable on it, and they couldn't take it off. So instead of taking it off, they tried to destroy the picture, destroy the film. So they've got a knife, and they've just slammed the knife into the top of the camera.
It doesn't surprise me that people are anywhere anymore in this world. I'd be more surprised if we found a spot where there really weren't any people penetrating there.
It's a male.
It's a male. It's a young male. It looks like 2 years old.
A lot of people ask me why I do the work I do. There's a lot of reasons, but basically, I'm just tired of watching animals die.
So there we've got it. Footage that depicts the science accurately and offers us a cliffhanger as in traditional storytelling. When we edited the complete story, we carried it through a couple of more scenes that I don't have time to show you here, of Alan talking to villagers to find out what was going on, of them trying to track down the poachers and find out where they were and who was actually causing this damage. And then we moved on to other stories in the film. But in the final film, we then came back to Alan's saga because, of course, as a story, it needed an end to go with the beginning and the middle. At the end of the expedition back in Bangkok, Alan got the exposed film processed. It was delivered to the hotel, and of course, our cameraman was nowhere to be found. So Kate wouldn't let Alan look at the pictures. I can tell you that stretched goodwill a little bit, but eventually the cameraman reappeared, and Alan and Tony began to look at the photographs. And so I have this small piece at the end which sort of concludes the story.
The other teams have collected all their cameras without trouble. 33 rolls of film in all.
Oh, look at this.
What you got here? That's a
That was
beauty. But I got a
probably-
better one for you. Look at this.
Wow. Now that's a nice picture.
Tiger and leopard. Another leopard.
Another tiger. There we go.
Holy cow.
Look at that.
I'm
Oh,
assuming
look.
this is sambar deer. That's a nice
That's a
tiger.
really nice
Well, that's
tiger.
a nice shot.
Now, this is really interesting. Poachers or local people or something or other. This is the
We got
Peppery
the-
River. This is the second route.
This is
This
the
is-
one where I walked up 10 years
Yeah,
ago?
yeah.
That one? That
That.
is some area. Look at this tape here.
Tape here, yeah. Whew. Look at that. We've got great. Look at this. Siamese crocodile.
Oh, there it is. Look at that.
Crocodile.
This is the first recent photo of Siamese crocodile in Thailand. While we were sleeping, while we were walking, while we were swimming in the river, all these animals were wandering around us. The tigers were walking around us, the leopards. The Siamese crocodile might have been in the water at another part of the stream at the same time we were jumping in and cooling off. It was definitely near us when we were standing on its beach. I know the tigers heard us. Probably several saw us. I know that the elephants froze there in the forest and we went by as if, wow, what a neat forest. There are still places left where the natural evolutionary processes are going on. Most of my career involves documenting species on the verge of extinction. But every now and then, you get a place like this, and you say, it's not lost yet. It's not gone yet. Really? That close? Knowledge is...
So there we were, presenting science in a way that was simple but not simplistic, and framing it in a narrative with all the elements of story, an arc, compelling characters, a quest, a challenge, drama, and a reasonably satisfying conclusion. Thank you.
This program is presented by University of California Television. Like what you learn? Visit our website or follow us on Facebook and Twitter to keep up with the latest UCTV programs.
Well, thank you, Susan, for that overly generous introduction. Some of that may even be true, I think. I'm delighted to be here and actually grateful for Ron Rice and Susanna Scott for tackling a topic that's near and dear to my heart. I've devoted much of my professional life, say in the past 15 years, to take a hard look at global sustainability. Specifically, how can the 7.2 billion of us live sustainably on this planet, or more specifically, for how long? And I'm always thinking of different ways to try to get across ideas and make them accessible to readers. And that's who I write for, sort of a general audience. Now, I wish, we talked a little bit about, a question came up about humor, and I'd wish that we could use humor to get across these inconvenient truths. But there's a shocking lack of good jokes about degraded environment or climate change out there. And comedians, when asked about this, have tried to explain why. And they say it's simply too earnest, and it's too dull and boring, and too worthy of serious reflection to make it good material. And I think Bill Maher, let's see if this works. Yes. I think Bill Maher has got it right. He says that the environment has a technical problem, that it doesn't have an obvious, easy, funny target. And climate change is particularly tricky because it's a slow-moving disaster. Now, I have found that there are some visual gags that work, like this one that offers absolute proof that climate change is real, or the one that says, that shows my favorite forecast of all time. Looks like Friday is going to be rather warm. Fortunately, there are lots of other ways for us to get our heads around these big, slow-moving ideas, like climate change and the loss of nature, and I'm just going to share one. And I'd like to just start by telling you a story, and it was one of those that I collected while traveling the world to see for myself if our growing numbers was a significant factor in global sustainability, and if it is, what could be done about it. And what I'm talking about is the dreaded P word, population. It's actually something more controversial than climate change. And population growth specifically and all that it entails. And to start, I just want to take a quick spin around the globe and take you to Central Africa, Southwest Uganda, to the Windy Impenetrable National Park. And you can see the park boundaries here. It's where the rainforest gets hemmed in by all these subsistence farms. And this place is desperately poor. And people are poaching wood and other things from the forest. But what I found is when it comes to writing about Africans, particularly poor Africans, how hard it is to get editors at newspapers or generally Americans and generally to pay attention. It just seems too distant, and the troubles seem like too much. Fortunately for me, I was there to meet Gladys Kalima Zukusoka. And Gladys was a veterinarian who worked for the Uganda Wildlife Authority. And she had found her life's calling to help the last 880 mountain gorillas from going extinct. And gorillas here were getting sick from diseases they were picking up from humans, mostly measles and scabies. And there was one incident that really made a huge difference in her life, and that was that a baby gorilla had picked up such a severe case of scabies, it had lost most of that thick fur that they need to survive in these cool, misty mountains. And Gladys heard this baby, it was crying, and she said this is extremely unusual for baby gorillas, unlike humans, that they almost never make a sound, and if it is, it's a happy sound. But this one was clearly in pain, and it was very frustrating for her. She followed them around, this group of gorillas, for days, but could never get in a position to tranquilize them all, to dart them all. And that's about the only way you can safely intervene, is to dart the whole group. Finally, this baby died, and the mother was carrying it around for days, sort of poking at it, just didn't understand what happened, that this baby had died of pneumonia. And she finally abandoned it. Finally abandoned it. And Gladys was just torn up. She felt completely helpless. There was nothing she could do to make a difference. And she felt like her job wasn't really being very effective. So she quit her job with the government and founded a nonprofit group to focus on what she sees as the biggest threat, and that's pressures from population growth around windy impenetrable forest. And the local hospital, when I was there, had shelves just filled with antiretroviral drugs, thanks to our tax dollars, to fight AIDS and HIV. But you couldn't find a condom, you couldn't find any other kind of contraception. So Gladys decided to start training women in the villages to turn their homes, like Monica's house here, into makeshift clinics, to do some basic sort of curative care, but also do what turned out to be the most popular thing, and that was to provide shots of Depo-Provera, it's a hormone, to women who want to avoid being pregnant. And this became really popular. And when I was there, there was a clinic being held, and this woman showed up, and I said, well, why are you here? And she said, I have 6 children, and I'm really tired. And she said, I don't have the energy to dig a bigger garden and to feed any more children. And she also said she didn't know about this medicine that could protect her from pregnancy until Monica showed up after this training with this magic vial. And since then, this woman has shown up every 3 months without fail to sort of take control of her future. And what dawned on me at this moment was that what was good for this woman and her family on a deeply personal level was also good for the forest and for the endangered mountain gorillas. And given that deforestation is a significant part of climate change, that it has some incremental way a benefit to one of the most daunting global challenges of our time. And this was the big aha moment for me. You know, I started out my reporting to see, you know, was human population growth a factor in sustainability? Was it an environmental issue? And it is. But I also found out it was a human rights issue. And it's not about telling poor women in developing countries how many babies to have. You know, it's empowering these women to make decisions for themselves, to be able to plan their lives, their futures, and their families. And I've seen this over and over again on my travels, that if women have access to modern contraception and can get freed from the pressures of society, and that's controlling religious and tribal leaders, husbands, and mostly importantly, mothers-in-law, believe it or not, that they quickly act like women just here in this country and decide to have 2 children apiece on average. Now, did this story work? I would argue it did, but not for the reasons I just told you about my personal aha moment, but from what I just showed you. You know, it's got a couple things going for it. It's got charismatic megafauna, and I exploit these charismatic creatures every chance I get. It's also got a compelling character, you know, a wildlife veterinarian who isn't afraid to reveal her passion. And Gladys, her enthusiasm is completely contagious, and it just takes one person. In fact, storytelling is almost always better with just one. And so for those of you who are either scientists, or hopefully we have some who are training to be scientists here, my advice always is to answer that reporter's phone call if it comes, you know, and don't hide in your lab. Too many scientists have this mistaken notion that to reveal passion for your work is somehow unscientific. And in reality, I think if you want people to care about what you do, if you want to open their minds and their hearts, I think you have to be more forthcoming with your own. And people, I think, are generally, we brought this up earlier, are interested in scientists because their jobs are really unusual. I mean, a lot of people haven't met that many scientists, and very often you're really at the cutting edge of knowledge. Now, you heard earlier that I'd worked at the LA Times for a long time, and I think I'm the only card-carrying member of the mainstream media on this panel. And even that, my card is somewhat lapsed because I took a buyout about a little more than a year ago from the Times. And I've since joined the ranks of freelance writers with Jennifer and others. So why did I leave? That's a fair question. I'm going to show you why. If I can get a show of hands, how many of you get one of these things at home, delivered home? Can I see hands? All right, just look around. All right. How many of you get 2 of those? And let's see 2 pairs of hands. Okay. How many of you were raised in a household where your parents had one of these? Okay. Now you can see why I'm not there. The LA Times, like almost all newspapers, is suffering from a stunning drop in circulation and advertising revenue, and it's painful to watch that the journalistic ambitions have been shrinking along with the budgets. And it's just a new reality, the editors tell me, you know, And general interest publications, they want to be relevant, but they need to be popular. It's a desperate need. It matters to the bottom line. All those subscriptions, all those clicks on their website are directly related to the value of advertising dollars. And so editors push, that pushes editors rather to dish up material they think that readers want, that will make them more popular. And I wish I could say otherwise, but the assumed prescription for success is often not a climate change story. Or looking at, drilling rigs like here near Bakersfield, or an environmental story, like the clear cutting in British Columbia, and taking a hard look at some of our actions as the Earth groans along in the Anthropocene. Instead, the well-documented clicks, and these are really well measured, follow the more acute tragedies like a plane crash or yesterday's train crash, or a hurricane, or all too often, and I find this quite a mystery to me, you've got beauty, and celebrity, instant celebrity, and even better when a celebrity, gets into trouble. And so how do those of us who like to write about climate change and environment do in the competition for space against these kinds of stories? Not very well. In fact, this has been measured by Media Matters. They looked at ocean acidification versus the Kardashian sisters. I have written a lot about ocean acidification, and that's those small bars off the left, and you can see how well the Kardashian sisters do. Now, I would be the first to admit that environmental stories are difficult to communicate to general audiences. They're all too often they're depressing. They can make readers feel overwhelmed by the scope of the problems. They can be dull, given their slow, incremental pace of change. And it's the same problem that doesn't make them good fodder for jokes. All this makes it just very easy for readers to want to turn the page, click to a different station, just click to a different website. Yet I have found there's a few tricks. I think it's always important to show these stories, not to tell them, and to single out a key character, if you can, to give audiences a way into the sort of the larger, more complex topic. And of course, there's the charismatic critters, to use anytime we get a chance. So how do we compete with, say, Lindsay Lohan, which the LA Times is always fascinated by? Try to give them this. How do we compete with a Nick on a bender? We try to give them this. Now, I like to joke about exploiting these critters, right? And especially ones with big eyes. But these charismatic creatures are actually ambassadors to the natural world, and I think many of us, we seek a connection with nature, and I feel like my job is to help make that connection. So I'm going to wrap up with one final example. I was asked to do a story looking at secondary effects of lead poisoning. And some of you may have heard about this fight over lead bullets, perhaps because so many California condors have been dying after wolfing down lead-laced carrion filled with bullet fragments. Some hunters say that this is part of the conspiracy to take away their firearms, and others say no, it's just a way to switch to, please switch to non-lead bullets that don't fragment, even though they cost twice as much, they don't fragment the way lead bullets do. And it's fascinating to look at this when you see the lead bullet, when it hits, say, a deer, for example, it can spray something like 18 inches from the entry wound. And then when hunters field dress their deer, so they don't have to pack the whole animal out and leave these gut piles behind, all sorts of other critters, wolf down the entrails and then can end up with a toxic dose of lead, including our nation's bird. And lead can turn this strutting, scrappy, bald eagle into this pathetic, drooped wing warrior. There have been studies that have been looking at this, as this become an emerging issue in the nation's heartland. There's lots of data and statistics, but is this the best way to tell that story? I think there's a woman named Brene Brown at University of Houston. I think she's got it right, that stories are just data with a soul. We remember them longer and we hold them closer. And my editor and I decided that the best way was to follow the case of just one eagle. And so to do this story, I set off for Wilson, Wyoming, which is next to Jackson in the Jackson Hole, to the Teton Raptor Center. And this is a place where they work very hard to try to rehab birds of prey that come to them. And I picked up the trail of one eagle that was found by a rancher sitting in the snow. And he was in this lead-induced stupor, and he was simply too sick to fly. And he was transported by a pair of game wardens up and over the Continental Divide, more than 100 miles to the Raptor Center. And usually the wardens, they, as this one told me, they simply dispatch them with the revolvers because they know that very few are going to make it. When this eagle was brought into the Raptor Center, the staff there had just lost 2 bald eagles in a row to lead poisoning in quick succession. And so in consulting with a local veterinarian, Dan Foreman, who volunteers his time, they decided to do more than just the usual, just the force feeding of fluids, which they do 3 times a day, and sticking the bird in an oxygen chamber, because the lead can sort of reduce so much of the muscle function that it makes it very hard for these animals to get enough air and live. This time they decided to go much more aggressive, and they took this 3.5-inch spinal needle and they shoved it into the eagle's longest bone and created this catheter that was then infusing the eagle with this concoction of antibiotics, fluids, and also a chelating agent that would bond with the lead in the bloodstream and help flush it from the system. And after a while, it was interesting, this eagle, unlike those before it, that had died before it, suddenly snapped out of its lethargy. And it happened to happen just when one of the workers was lifting the eagle out of this oxygen chamber, and using that sharp beak you can see that is built by evolution for ripping flesh, clamped down on Megan's cheek. She was one of the workers there, and punched a hole on it. And she finally wrestled this eagle back into position and had a hold of his head. And she's looking at her cheek, and the blood is running down her face. And her reaction is, "Oh, good, maybe this one will make it." So this story was about an eagle, but it was also about these care workers who just work 3 times a day. They're feeding 7 days a week, anything it takes to try to save these birds. And and Megan knew the odds weren't very good. 3 out of 4 of these lead poisoned birds don't make it. And it was touch and go for this eagle as well. And so I think doing the story on lead poisoning worked better just focusing on one. And I'm going to close with a very short video that captured a rare moment in this line of rehab work.
All right, so we're going to count to 3. I'll pull the hood off, and Dr. Foreman's going to send it off to the east. Here we go. Everybody count.
1, 2, 3.
It never hurts to infuse just a little bit of hope in an environmental story. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be here. As Jennifer said earlier today, I truly believe, having studied science communication since 1999 when I started graduate school, we are living in a golden age for science communication. There's more opportunities for scientists to engage the public and reach the public than any time in history. And I was saying to Ron this morning, there truly is an explosion of science communication research, particularly in the area of, across different topics and different issues, but particularly in the area of sustainability and climate change. I was mentioning it's difficult now for me even to keep up with the vast amount of research that's appearing across different journals at the interdisciplinary level and the disciplinary level. As a researcher, I've done a number of studies, and I've focused primarily on how the general public comes to understand complex scientific and environmental related issues, looking in particular at the role of the media, particularly the role of the media in selectively framing issues in specific ways, and how these selective frames interact with the social background, the ideology, and the political background of the public, much like we saw in the movie last night, Merchants of Doubt, the selective framing of those who deny climate change and how it interacts with ideology, particularly conservative ideology, and how these arguments are then carried through different channels of the media, outlets such as Fox News, but also the mainstream press. In 2006, I moved from the faculty at Ohio State to American University in Washington, D.C. One of the reasons I wanted to move to Washington, D.C. is I wanted to be able to take my research and directly interact with science organizations, federal agencies, and environmental groups who are trying to reach the public and trying to engage the public, and also policymakers themselves and journalists. And I spent a lot of time sitting in closed-door meetings and going to public meetings like this. And through that experience, I started to think that there's another public that matters here in debates over climate change and other science issues. And that's influentials, people like yourselves, people who are academics, people who are deeply committed to action, people who might be advocates, but it also includes people like journalists and funders and philanthropists and others who we often don't study, we often don't problematicize the way we do the general public. And I started to think, so when I went to these meetings and I would look at people's sort of judgments and decisions and the frames of reference they would use in talking about complex problems like climate change, I observed certain things, also watching documentary films as well. So for example, one of the clips this morning, looking at the scientists working in South Asia, his description of nature was a very particular framing of nature, that nature is possibly only of value if it's pristine, if it's untouched by man. There was a comment there about how being out in the jungle, this pristine place, he was able to observe evolutionary processes in their true form. The implication is that evolution in nature only comes in its true form in the absence of humans, right? That's one particular way of thinking about nature and evolution, but it's not the only way. It's not and that's a contested interpretation of nature. But that model, that mental model, has direct implications for how we think about conservation policy and how we debate and discuss the issue among influentials, including academics and experts. In the documentary last night, at the end of the documentary, my colleague Saul Hart, who you'll hear from later today, sort of the moral lesson of the film and the focus on solutions at the end, the sort of takeaway is a dominant narrative, as we'll talk about, that's been sort of dominant since at least Inconvenient Truth, is that climate change is solved by pricing carbon, so passing a carbon tax, and then we have the technologies we need to tackle the problem. We're just missing political will, right? And those technologies, as you saw at the end, were solar and wind. And if we could only overcome denial or speak up, as the film tells us at the end, then we'd be able to solve climate change. So I decided when I was on sabbatical in 2012 that I started to need to say, well, where do these stories come from that influence influentials and decision makers, right? How we talk about these issues. So I decided I need to start looking at a switch lens from the audience being the general public to being people like ourselves. And I decided I needed to look at sort of the superachieving storytellers, right, that we often read, that we might become interested in an issue by reading these popular authors. People like Bill McKibben, people like Tom Friedman, people like Andrew Revkin, who I know spoke here at UC Santa Barbara in the fall. And I decided I need to look and go back and look at the literature on the role that public intellectuals play in how we think and decide complex issues and how they shape debate. And that's what I'm going to talk about today, some of that research that I've begun to publish on and I continue to take a look at. So in 2010, I started working on a project where I was looking at, in part, how the major foundations who have funded action on climate and energy, these are 9 major foundations, some of the wealthiest foundations in the world, how they define climate change as a social problem, what the solutions might be. And their planning document, their master planning document, was a 50-page document called the Design to Win document. They hired a consulting firm to interview economists and scientists. And the planning document was released a few months, about 6 months after Inconvenient Truth came out. And the framing in that document, what kind of problem is climate change and what might be the solutions, directly reflect the narrative that Al Gore talked about in that film. And that was that, as many people, economists like Nicholas Stern talk about, that climate change is fundamentally a market failure. And it's correctable by putting a price on carbon. If we only price carbon, then the market itself will drive social change. So the report talks about a cap on carbon output and an accompanying market for emissions permits will prompt a sea change that washes over the entire global economy. And like last night's film ended on, and Inconvenient Truth ended on, the good news is that we already have the technology, know how to achieve these carbon reductions off at a cost savings. So that's solar, wind, and efficiency were the technologies that were talked about in the report. The report is noticeable that it's a 50-page document, only has a couple paragraphs about communication and communication challenges, even though they were planning to fund different types of communication strategies and campaigns. And this is Hal Harvey, who was the program officer at the Hewlett Foundation, who commissioned the report, went on to head up the Climate Works, being interviewed by Tom Friedman. I think this was in 2009. As Hal Harvey defined or framed the challenge is that climate change, unlike a lot of large-scale problems, is actually one that is solvable, right? We can solve climate change. It is also one where we know what we need to do. We have the best data in the world on how to prevent climate change. Everything was ranked by magnitude, location, and sector. It's a systematic approach to problem solving. So in this statement, it's a frame of reference that climate change is a technocratic problem, right? If we can just mobilize the power of science economics, we can solve it. And this is the funding strategy. This is how the foundations then decided, based on this framing of the issue, what kind of programs and activities to fund. So what I did is I put together a database of about 1,247 grants. Each grant had a description of the policy or technology or the action that it was funding. And then I just coded each grant by that focus, and then I tallied up the results. And so you can see the differential emphasis in investments. There was a heavy investment. Overall, the foundations, I had a record of about $360 million in grants. There was some missing data. So it was about $550 million that I estimated that they invested in climate and energy across these years. And so there was a heavy focus on what's called the soft energy path, right? An investment in renewables, solar, wind, different carbon pricing strategies, cap and trade, and international agreement, and then things like fuel economy standards and public transportation. What was missing from their investment was an alternative set of technologies that a lot of experts argue that we need to solve climate change or to meaningfully reduce emissions. And that is things focusing on the development or the evaluation of carbon capture and storage. There was not a single grant focused on nuclear energy, as an example. Or importantly, the role of government through research and development, planning and spending, and catalyzing the innovation, not the market, but government in driving the innovation that we need. And then finally, there was a very limited focus on resilience strategy or public health or the human dimensions of the issue. So very little funding on adaptation and resilience, which seems odd today because there's so much focus on resilience now, protecting public health, or importantly on justice and equity. So this was the dominant paradigm. This was the dominant framing that drove a lot of strategy, a lot of investment, as you see, going up through 2011 and the defeat of cap and trade. And in the wake of the defeat of cap and trade and the perceived failure of Copenhagen, there was now a paradigmatic vacuum, right? There was room for alternative frames, alternative stories to emerge that offered up a different rendering of the problem and what needed to be done. And this is what we see over the last couple of years in the growth of the climate justice movement, captured most recently by the international bestseller by Naomi Klein, called This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate, and also was sort of the animating narrative that inspired many people in direct action across communities across the country, but also, for example, in the climate march in New York City last year that turned out 350,000 people. So for Naomi Klein, climate change is not correctable by the market. In fact, actually, it's a problem driven by capitalism. And if we're going to solve climate change, we actually have to upend the status quo, right? We actually have to challenge our accepted norms of capitalism. We need to degrow our economies. We need to retreat from globalization. And we need to, as Bill McKibben, who is also sort of our intellectual confederate, says, we need to give up our too muchness, right? We need to turn away from consumption and materialism. And there's a very strong technology narrative as well. They share an interpretation with sort of mainstream environmentalism that we need to switch from fossil fuels to renewables, right? And there's along with the movement, animating the movement is also a strong opposition and resistance to natural gas fracking and also nuclear energy. But there's a third rendering. There's a sort of a minority perspective, right? That's beginning to emerge. You might have heard, some of you might have heard about this. It's called, they call themselves the eco-modernists. They recently released the Eco-Modernist Manifesto. I have a commentary in the Chronicle of Higher Education this week about the Eco-Modernist Manifesto, comparing it to these other discourses and narratives. And around the time that the climate march was happening, the hashtag on Twitter for the climate march was People's Climate. And Andrew Revkin, who spoke here in the fall, who maybe doesn't self-describe as an eco-monetarist, but I put him in that category, he started tweeting under the hashtag People's Energy. And this argument, as Ken showed us earlier, the argument of eco-monitors is that when we're tackling climate change, we can't forget about the energy access problem. In fact, we have a moral duty to think about people living in places like Africa, in these deeply underdeveloped countries, right? And what they argue is that these countries are going to meet their human development goals. As you can see, this is a figure from the Clean Air Task Force, a group in Boston that I've worked with. When we look at the relationship between energy access, energy consumption, and human development, the countries that have the greatest amount of consumption and access to energy score the highest on the Human Development Index, right? And each one of these countries are trying to climb that index, right? Their political leaders and their publics are demanding an increase in their economic growth, not just their economic growth, but their human security, right? And unless we can provide them access to energy, right, we're not going to enable their demand. And so we need to think about policies and technologies that meet this energy demand problem. And renewables are probably not going to meet that challenge, or at least the renewables we have today. Okay, so here's what's interesting, is that on the center left and on the left, among intellectuals and advocates arguing for action on climate change, there are important and clear distinctions in how they frame the issue, the problem, and what they see as solutions. Why is this the case? And as I started working on this during my sabbatical, I read a book that's been very influential to me by a scientist in the UK who used to head up the Tyndall Center on Climate Research, Mike Hume. This book is called Why We Disagree About Climate Change. And he kind of helped popularize this idea from the policy sciences about this idea of climate change being a super wicked problem. Unlike the foundations as they defined it, climate change is not conventionally solvable. We're going to do better or worse at managing it, right? Hopefully we'll do better. But because of its complexity, its uncertainty, oftentimes in climate change, we think we have a solution, but that actually shows us more dimensions of the problem. So corn-based ethanol and biofuels would be an example where we thought that was, or proposed or framed as a solution. It actually ends up using more land and emitting more emissions, right? So it generates more of the problem. And out of this complexity and uncertainty, people on the center left and on the left, but people on the right as well, they read into climate change their hope for future, what they believe to be the good society. And it becomes an opportunity for, as we see with the climate justice movement, and Naomi Klein argues, for example, that climate change is an opportunity for people on the left to finally fulfill their social justice goals. In fact, to correct the wrongs of slavery and colonialism. People on the left who have worried about economic justice and globalization have not worked on climate change in the past. You've been overlooking your best opportunity to achieve your goals. Right? For the Design to Win report, climate change was an opportunity to sort of reinvent sort of this technocratic society where we have market-based action around renewables, which they've long argued for as an alternative to fossil fuels. And so as Mike Hume writes in a recent collection of essays, climate change is a synecdoche, a figurative turn of phrase in which something stands in for something else, for something more important than simply the way humans are changing the weather. Okay, so if that's the nature of climate change as a social problem, what role do public intellectuals play? These super achieving storytellers, right? Who is a public intellectual? And I had to look at this literature across different fields to figure this out. And one of the key defining characteristics of a public intellectual is that they write for a broader audience, right? But they're more than just popularizers. They're more than just a scientist writing about their technical field for a broader audience. They go beyond their technical field and they engage in deep synthesis and integration. They give us a bigger understanding of the problem. But they do something else as well. And so Elizabeth Kolbert, for example, who just won the Pulitzer Prize, she does both of these things in her writing and her books. But she stops short of something that I would say is a key characteristic of public intellectual, others have argued. That's that they're social critics. They're advocating for change. They're advocating for particular causes or particular policy direction. Sometimes themselves, like Bill McKibben or Naomi Klein, they become movement leaders. They become activists themselves. And then how do they influence us? Well, one of the things that I talk about in this paper that I just published, in part they become personalities and celebrities. And as Jennifer talked about in her talk this morning, they take advantage of this online media ecosystem where their influence transcends beyond their books or a printed article, where people across the globe now can grow up as students or as advocates reading their work. So Bill McKibben's piece on divestment at Rolling Stone magazine, it helped launch this movement. It went instantly viral. It was the most read article in the history of Rolling Stone magazine online. Right? But importantly, when they reach people, what they do is they set a particular frame of reference. They create storylines and narratives about what kind of problem climate change is. And these discourses and narratives, without direct, overt coordination among advocacy groups, among advocates, among students, among journalists, right? They help set the conditions through which people talk and think about these problems, right? So they have sort of an indirect, sort of an informal coordinating function, right? People study, work, and advocate within one discourse over another. So what I started doing is I started looking at who are these public intellectuals across these discourses, and I spent better part of a year reading all of their books. And in the recent article, and I'm working on some other papers and eventually a book on this topic, I then try to condense down these different discourses into a single table that I then elaborate on in the paper. And this is how I break them out. I talk about the ecological activists, who are people like Naomi Klein, Bill McKibben, people like David Suzuki, Clive Hamilton, a philosopher in Australia. Their problem framing is fundamentally climate change is a function of our too muchness, of capitalism. And the only way that we correct or we solve climate change or try to limit climate change is by upending our capitalist system. Their outlook on nature is reflective of the outlook the scientists this morning offered, that nature is this sacred, pristine, fragile place. In fact, there's a religious quality to nature. It's a place that we go to lose ourselves, right? And it should be walled off. It should be uncontaminated by the presence of humans. And the other, and I'll wrap up in just 1 minute, right? So the other major discourse are the smart growth reformers. This still remains the dominant paradigm. It's reflected in the foundation strategy that I showed you. People like Tom Friedman, people like Nicholas Stern, people like Jeffrey Sachs, right? That climate change is correctable by putting a price on carbon. And then the final discourse, and I need to wrap up here, but the final discourse are the eco-modernists. The key distinction of the eco-modernists are two things. One is they say, yeah, price on carbon is important, but we can't overlook the central role of the state. We need state planning and state spending that drives the innovation we need, right? And also, we don't have the arsenal of technologies we need to deal with the problem. We need to consider things like nuclear energy, carbon capture, things like genetically modified food and agriculture and other things. Their model of politics is also different. They say that political change happens primarily through self-reflection, right, and in engaging in ideas and discussion and dialogue with others. And once innovation happens and technology is available that lowers the cost of action, that's when political leaders and the public will finally agree across the ideological spectrum to act on behalf of the same goal. Okay, so I'm out of time. There's a lot there. But if you want to read these papers, you can go to my website, climateshiftproject.org, studies, and you can find all those papers freely available online. Thanks.
Okay, by the way, English major, UCSB. Yay! Okay, so you're a researcher on this campus, you're an engineer, you're a scientist, and you've discovered this cool new thing. You've made some innovation, you have some insight that you want to talk to people about. The thing is, the language of your discovery, usually featured in some high-profile academic journal, is not as accessible to the public as you would like it to be. It sounds great for explaining to other scientists and engineers, but if you're trying to reach out to the general public, most of this will fly over their heads. This is where I and my colleagues come in. As writers for the Office of Public Affairs and Communications on this campus, our jobs are to make research written in this exacting and very technical language more digestible to our audience, the general public. We can do this for virtually every discipline on campus, including the humanities, social sciences, and arts education. But science and engineering, I have to say, are special creatures. Because of the level of technicality, high-level research like the kind that happens here deals with things that most people don't normally think about or encounter in the course of everyday life. And yet these scientific developments are the kinds of things that have the potential to influence policy decisions, business practices, or even the way society functions or chooses to function. And so these people, this general public who vote, who invest money, participate in economies, raise future generations, use natural resources, run for office, these people need to access science in a way that's understandable and also meaningful, and ideally make evidence-based decisions that could benefit humanity in general, or at least do no harm. So I'm really glad to see the way humanities and sciences are coming together to suss out the issue of how to communicate about science. I think there's generally a recognition of the importance of knowing science and a desire to be able to access it without the intimidation of having to spend too much time getting technical, or the presumption that it's just too difficult to understand and so therefore not worth the effort. This particular moment is also significant because we as a modern society have become more aware of the impacts our actions have on other people in other places and vice versa. And the problems we face now are large scale and global and would take everyone's effort, understanding, critical thinking, and participation to solve. So, the beauty of writing for the general audience is the reach. We try to talk to everyone. We have the internet, we have social media in addition to traditional sources of news and information. Never has it been so easy to reach people next door or the other side of the earth. The challenge of writing for the general audience is also the reach. We're trying to talk to everyone. So how does one convey the information to people who may not have the interest or the background to process it? When you write about topics that are new discoveries, innovations, emerging technology, how much can you assume people know? There's really no one slam dunk answer for these questions, especially for those of us who write for the general public. They're just challenges that we face constantly. And actually, personally, it's part of the beauty of science writing is because it allows you to get creative with how you express your ideas. The good thing is we have a lot of tools at our disposal. We've heard a lot about them today. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go and get really specific to what we do at the Office of Public Affairs and Communications. Can we get the presentation? Oh wait, actually, let's not yet. Let's just go back to the other one, yeah. All right, so I forgot about this. Allow me to introduce you to the UCSB Current, which is our main platform for communication. And you can check it out, there's the link up there. And this is actually a hybrid. We talked about this ecosystem of communications earlier. And it's a hybrid of all our news releases and our stories online. And it's also a news source. So people can actually, journalists can actually use this material and use it as source material or as part of their stories. But people also come to this site itself just for the news and research information. It's about 1.5 years old, and we are constantly making improvements. So there's a lot, we've talked about things like storytelling and narrative, and if you actually read some of our stories, a lot of them, I refer to them as stories also, not just press releases, a lot of them generally offer more than just the facts. When I first started working for public affairs, one of the first things my news director told me was that we are storytellers. We're not just pumping out press releases. And since the majority of us in the office are actually former journalists, we're really okay with that. This is what we like to do. And we've already talked about how stories are often the best way to convey complex science because context is everything. When you're writing for an audience with different levels of awareness and knowledge about new and technical things, context is what's going to help level the field for everyone. Finding a human-sized element for people to identify with is what's going to sustain their interests and keep them coming back. And this has been mentioned a little bit earlier. Another reason context and stories are so important to us that in journalism is that journalism has been and is changing, at least in the print newspaper sense, which is where I come from. Newspapers can't really afford to pay someone to focus on the science alone, let alone with the diligence and the responsibility and just the research required to turn out a good story. So in a way, when we write some of our stories here, we try to meet them halfway. We try to provide that context or that way of entering into the subject. Also, you've probably noticed how easy it is in this day of digital media and social media to chop things up and extract only bits of information. Sometimes it's just a meme. Sometimes it can be pretty dangerous, like when a politician of one persuasion or another uses some scientific bullet point sans context to influence legislation. Now, we can't police that from where we are, but we can at least try to make sure that there is something out there that has the correct information and the appropriate context. So here's the process, and there's like 3 things here. Which one do I use? The Prezi. Okay, and how do you move forward?
Forward is the right one.
Okay. All right, so let's see if this works. Yeah, you're gonna have to do it for me. It's really quick. Can you just move ahead? Am I? Oh yeah, there you go. I don't know how it got all the way over there. All right, yay, thank you. Okay, so here is how we tell our story. So we get the tip. A lot of times we get the Eureka Alert notice. Does everybody know what Eureka Alert or has any familiarity with what Eureka Alert is? Okay, it coordinates the publication of studies with journalists who write about those studies, and it's actually really interesting. So we get these notifications via Eureka Alert of soon-to-be-published papers involving UCSB researchers. And we also find out through word of mouth. We get told that something's gonna happen, something's coming out, so we're on the alert for that. Secondly, we contact our scientist. Does the researcher want a story written about his or her paper? If no, then game over, we're done. If yes, then we set up interviews, and a lot of times we actually do get yes. And sometimes the research doesn't warrant a story, or there's not enough time, or it's just inconvenient, or people are out of town. So there's a lot of reasons why stories don't happen, but most of the time we get yes, and because of the kind of technology we have, we can actually communicate, everywhere, so that's great. The next thing is the interview and writing of the story. The interview can be, we use pretty much any media we can to get in touch with our scientists. I prefer face-to-face interactions the most. I think I get the most information out of all of them, especially since I am not a scientist and I need all sorts of ways of understanding things. After that, we send the story out to the researcher or the group, and this is fact-checking, basically. This is getting the science right. They make any comments, they make suggestions, and there's this whole, this can happen once and we can move on to the next step, or we can do it over and over again until everybody's happy, basically. And it depends. If there are lots of researchers, it might take a while. If not, everybody has their kind of mood about this. Some people decide they just they're okay with it and we're ready to go. Other people are very picky about things. So that's the kind of thing that we have to negotiate, because we really want our scientists to be satisfied with what's going out, because it has to be defensible. It represents the university, it represents them, and when something wrong goes out, as we've noticed earlier with the God particle situation, it can be very wrong. So nothing is sent to the media until everyone is satisfied, and that kind of can be tricky, especially when you're reiterating the same review and rewrite over and over again. But if I'm lucky enough to get my draft back and everybody's happy, I wind up sending it through my office for just style edits and grammar, because we are former journalists and we like to conform to Associated Press. And so we make sure that everything sounds good, sounds smooth, works well. The next thing we do is we prepare for publication. We have the back end of the UCSB Current, and we work with the content management system. We load everything in there. Simultaneously, we've been getting photos or video if there's time and desire and effort and there's good material. And we put everything into the Current, and we add our tags and meta information so that it's for search purposes as well. And then we head it out to publishing. So the story goes live, and it's scheduled to coincide with the lifting of the embargo by the journal. The release is sent to Eureka Alert again, and they disseminate the information to their own list, and we have our own extensive list, including specialized media. And then internally, we will send a PDF version of the release and a link to the online story to the researcher, the group, the department chair, and the dean of the appropriate college. So we email ourselves everything as well. And that's pretty much it as far as what we do in the office. It's kind of a simplistic way, but this is what we do. So let me see, where am I? How do we know if the story got any attention? That's actually kind of difficult. We don't know, we can't say exactly how much attention a story can get. We say maybe we can tell maybe through social media if people respond or forward things, we can follow the story around that way. We can tell if other publications have picked it up, so that's also useful, but we can't really tell how many eyeballs have been on the story. That's kind of really difficult to assess. Generally speaking, we can estimate that some stories will be more popular than others. Usually stories with a more human, relatable component will be picked up, such as things like psychology, neurobiology, bioengineering tends to be pretty popular. And so we can estimate that it will have some wide distribution then. Environmental stories, obviously, are also a big deal, especially the large scale, the ones that have to do with large scale events like the ocean plastic pollution stories and oil spills and obviously climate change. So can we go back to the other one? Okay. So this is the most recent story I wrote on artificial intelligence, and I was really excited to write it because I hadn't written about artificial intelligence before. And Dmitry Strukov, you'll see him come out. He's in the photo. He's in the bottom right. He was a really great interview. He was excellent at breaking things down. The story almost just wrote itself. And I heard it got some good pickup, and I saw, and it's actually, even as of an hour ago, I was checking Google. It's still getting more play. So that's very positive, actually. So, and actually I also got emails from other people, from people across the world asking if they could reprint, translate, and it was actually more than I expected it to be for an artificial intelligence story. But, so what made it a worthwhile story? I think one of the reasons was that AI is actually just a very fascinating subject. It's an engineering discipline, but it studies how human cognition works. So there's that relatable factor to it. Also, artificial intelligence carries with it that kind of science fiction Hollywood appeal. It's really part of our culture. We have stories by Philip K. Dick. We have the Terminator movies. We have robots in every story that we tell ourselves. So so it actually kind of allows people to access it that way too. There is that component. And then the tech itself in the real world has the potential to solve problems, real problems. So I think in that particular case, this particular research, there's a little bit of something for everyone. And this group, particularly this group, was actually great. They were very responsive, very excited. They really wanted, they were eager to talk and get their news out. And so everything just got made really easy for me. Brian, up on the upper right-hand corner, he actually approached me and he said, "May I have the end quote?" He wanted the sort of, he was like, "I want the witty end quote," the sort of kind of the insightful thing that people say at the end of stories. There's always that person at the end of a story that summarizes the story. He wanted that. Basically, he had this punchline that he needed to set up. And so I was like, yeah, okay, let's do it, because I like that kind of collaboration. It shows they're excited and they're willing to engage. And so there is a Easter egg joke at the end of the story if you check it out. Okay, so finally, here's a short list of 3 things that I have found work when I'm communicating about science. Coming from a humanities background, talking to someone who's very knowledgeable about their own science, I often try to get as much information as possible. So the first thing I try to do is face-to-face communication. The face-to-face interview for me is one of the best tools for interviewing, and it also works the other way. If you are a scientist and you're worried about getting your message across to someone, it's easier to do so if you're doing it with a person as opposed to emails. I think it's a little bit more comforting. Also because essentially, at least in my position, I'm on the same team as the scientist, so I don't want to have that. There's that trust factor, basically, that you want to establish with them, that you are understanding what they are saying. And the communication itself works really well, too. We pick up little nonverbal cues about each other. If they notice that I'm not understanding them, which is quite often, they'll be like, well, modify my strategy to get you to understand what I'm talking about, and it happens quickly. So it's really great for that purpose. And also, I tend to pick up things about the researcher themselves as a person that make it into the story sometimes, like the jokes, like how they feel about their science, like their perspective, because they're scientists, and that's not something I would think about. And that, it'll make it into the jokes. If they have a favorite phrase that they use, then that works too, because they probably thought it was good. Secondly, the next strategy I have is to think visually. We have we're internet-based now, we're digital media, we're social media, and before it was mostly text, so as writers, we didn't really worry too much about the images, but now everything screams for it. You have to have it, and it creates more impact, and it is also more memorable. And it takes a lot of the burden of explanation away from the story as well, because then you don't spend that 1,000 words trying to explain a concept when you can actually just look at a picture. So that really works for the general audience. And the third thing, the last thing, is that people like to hear stories about problems being solved. It's very comforting to hear stories. We like that. All our stories about problems being solved, conflict resolution, evolution, how we manage to overcome things, and we've, as human beings, just been doing this whole time. So I think it bodes well for sustainable science and sustainable science communication that people actually like to hear about problems being solved, because now we have lots of problems and we're trying to create the awareness of all these problems, and at some point, maybe we can get people to participate also in the process of solving these problems through this kind of communication. One person that comes to mind when I talk about problems and solutions and the kind of attention that the stories that sometimes I write get, Frank Doyle in chemical engineering. He has an artificial pancreas, which is phenomenal because it really takes the guesswork away from how to dose for diabetes and when to shoot when to give yourself the injection. And that's a huge burden lifted. And so when I write stories about things like that, I get emails from people asking, where can I go do this? And we have an artificial pancreas for children coming out. Now I have parents emailing me going, where can I put my children in clinical trials? So people would actually be happy, I think, if the story was made clear enough to them and the solution was made clear enough to them, they would actually want to participate in the solution. They want to participate in the clinical trials. They want to participate in, certain pilot practices. So I think in that vein, I think we could keep them receptive as science communicators, and maybe the solution will come and we won't have to herd cats to get there. My ideal is that everybody understands, is eager, wants to do it, and will participate. So thanks to Dr. Susanna Scott and Dr. Ronald Rice for the opportunity to speak, and also for me to examine what I do and what people in my situation can do.